If you process your landscape images on Lightroom, then you're going to love this video because in the next few minutes, I'm going to show you how to light paint with the masking panel, which is an advanced technique that can instantly add depth, texture, and interest by simply enhancing the natural light of your landscape. We're not making any dramatic or otherworldly changes here, we're simply amplifying what's already there. And here's the best part. You have full manual control over how you want to shape this light. There's no AI involved here. We're not using presets because, thanks to the masking panel, we can now use this incredibly dynamic technique that previously we could only use over in Photoshop with layers. So I can't wait to show you how all of this works. So before we get started, you may be wondering, what is light painting and how does this enhance the landscape? So when we bring our raw files into Lightroom, they almost always lack the impact we saw in the field. They are a dull and boring representation of what we photographed. And that can sometimes make you wonder, why did I even stop to take this photo in the first place? This isn't how I remember it and it looks awful. Now, as you probably know already, raw files are supposed to lack the dynamic light and drama that you witness in the field. Because in order to capture the full spectrum of light and detail, it needs to rein in a lot of that contrast. So your raw file appears to be a muted and dull representation of what you saw. And that's the benefit of raw format. Now, the drawback is that you have to reintroduce that interesting detail back into the image yourself through certain steps in your processing. You need to coax it out of that raw file. So that could mean deepening your shadows, brightening your highlights, adding contrast and vibrancy to those flat and boring colors. But the most powerful step you can take that will instantly add that interest, texture, and also just improve the overall quality of your image is by painting with light to add those essential highlights back into the image. This will not only enhance the visual interest, but will also add depth and texture back into your landscape, which is very important to have because we're working with a two-dimensional medium here. We need those visual references to perceive that depth in a flat photograph. And thanks to the masking panel, this is now possible right here in Lightroom. Now, here's the problem. Even if you already know that your image can benefit from some light painting, and most photographs can benefit from it, many photographers go about it the wrong way, and the results are lackluster. They don't bring out those reflective highlights, and instead it just adds like a warming filter, where the result it just looks like a blanket light adjustment across all your pixels. And this actually washes out the contrast. Like in this area right here, see how this tree line was warmed up, but there's no actual added texture or highlights that jump out at you. This is not light painting. That is just a localized white balance adjustment, which can look great, but the goal here is to paint with light, to intentionally bring out certain highlights to add that depth and interest, like in this example right here. See the difference in quality here and how those added highlights now jump out at you? So that is actually what you'll learn to create in this video, a highly tailored light painting mask that you can think of like a stencil that you place over your image and use that as a guide to bring out those muted muddy highlights that add that visual appeal. And trust me, once you learn how to create these masks, you'll be using them for much more than light painting. They're my favorite masks and end up using them for all sorts of color and tonal adjustments because they're so easy to create and they give you an unlimited amount of control over your adjustments. Now, a little disclaimer here, before we start creating these masks, you should already know how the masking panel works, at least the basics. So if you're totally new to the masking panel or you otherwise don't know the purpose behind it, then I encourage you to download my free Lightroom workflow cheat sheet because inside of that, you'll find a link to download additional videos on the masking panel. I'll be skipping over many of those important nuances here when it comes to masking. Otherwise, this video would be an hour long. So I'll add a link below this video where you can go and download that cheat sheet completely free. I really think those videos will be a great help here. And inside of the cheat sheet, you will also find a bird's eye view of my entire Lightroom workflow. I go over how to import, organize, process, and export. So it's a complete walkthrough from start to finish. So if that interests you, or if you want those additional videos on the masking panel, make sure to download your copy. All right, so let's jump over to Lightroom here and get started. So let's take a look at an example here. Here we have an image that I've already processed and I've added the color wheel here to the right so we can see the exact hues and tones that are being isolated by this mask. Now, one change I would like to make here is the reflective highlights on the tree line. Let's zoom into that. I'm gonna press and hold down my shift key, and we have this little magnifying glass that comes up, which will center your zooming. So just click and hold and drag to the right to zoom in or the left to zoom out around that point. So it's a lot easier than using the navigator here in the left panel. Now this tree line right here, it's looking a bit flat and uninteresting. And when I took the photo, I remembered the highlights from the setting sun were extremely bright along this tree line. You can kind of make them out here, but they're way more intense in person. So I would like to pull that out of the image by painting some light onto the tree line, which will not only add some interest, but will also balance out the composition, because right now, if we zoom out, the sunset in the foreground rock here, these are the main focal points. They have a huge concentration of local contrast. There's lots of color, lots of texture. There's just so much going on here with the highlights and shadows that they attract a lot of the attention. But this tree line over here on the left really melts into the background. So by adding those reflective highlights, it makes a photo more interesting, but it also encourages the viewer to explore more of the frame. Pull them off to the left a little bit. So how can we accomplish this? Well, the first thing that probably comes to mind is the masking panel, because of how simple it is to create local masks, meaning we are able to restrain this adjustment to a very localized area rather than applying these added highlights to the entire frame. Because remember, the goal here is to make this tree line more prominent. So if we applied light painting over the entire frame, that will globally increase the interest and defeat the purpose of this adjustment. However, we don't want to simply warm up the entire tree line. We're looking to paint reflective highlights, which means we need to take the brighter pixels, let's zoom back in, the brighter pixels like here and over here, isolate those, brighten them without affecting the midtone and shadow pixels at all, or at least at the same degree. Because the goal here is to widen the gap between the midtones and the shadows versus the highlights. This will increase the perceived local contrast of the tree line. Highlights get brighter and creates more space on the value scale between the midtones and shadows, and that will increase texture and interest. So let's add our mask here by first starting off with a range selection. So let's go over to the masking panel, open that up, go down to range, and we can start with either a color or a luminance range, or as I like to call it, a lightness range. So let's begin by adding a color range and start to narrow this selection down. Now, before I sample a color here, I just want to mention something. This is where photographers really limit themselves when it comes to the masking panel. They stop with just one selection method for their mask. And if the selection isn't what they want, they assume that the masking panel isn't working right, or they otherwise don't know how to use it, which couldn't be further from the truth. The true power of the masking panel comes from layering, or combining selection methods under a single mask to further narrow down the area that you're trying to isolate. The masking panel was specifically designed for you to use multiple selection methods and have them interact with each other in order to create the mask you need with minimal effort. That's why we have so many selection options here to start building our mask with. And then you cross-reference that initial selection with another one. You can think of it like a Venn diagram where you have one selection overlapping with a second selection, and where they meet, where they overlap, that is going to be your mask. Now, I do have a few lessons on the masking panel that you can access for free. There is a link in that Lightroom cheat sheet that I referenced earlier. We can go and download those, and they'll walk you through everything you need to know about the masking panel. It covers everything that I'm about to show you. So if you're not familiar with the masking panel, I encourage you to grab that cheat sheet and those lessons for a deeper dive. But very generally, every mask you create here in the masking panel will be paired with a particular adjustment. It's a transparency map that is tied to that adjustment. You pick out where you want this adjustment to appear in the image and where you want it not to appear. So for me, I only want it on this tree line. And I only want it on the brighter pixels of that tree line. So 2 layers here. I do not want it applied over the entire image, and I do not want it applied to the highlights of the entire image. So 2 selection methods working together in order to rein in this adjustment. So that's the ideal way to use a mask. And that's how professionals use them. They restrain their adjustments by using those 2 methods. Number 1, the pixel quality. This is either by color or lightness value. So your range selection methods, right over here, determine the pixel quality. And the second method for building your mask is by pixel location, where that pixel is physically on your frame. So in this case, just over the tree line. So by combining both of those methods, the quality selection and a location selection to build a single mask, you can quickly create that transparency map That's all a mask is. It's a transparency map that is completely tailored to not only the unique content of your image, but also it greatly enhances the quality of that adjustment. Now, if you're not quite sure how this setup enhances the quality of your adjustment, don't worry. We're going to see a few examples of that in just a minute with our light painting. All right, so now that we got that out of the way, let's begin with a color range selection. Let's go back, select color range. We got our eyedropper where we can sample a color on the tree line. And this will help us restrict the adjustment just to the tree line here because that is mostly green and is bordered by a non-green sky. So let's sample and refine the amount a little bit, exclude more of that sky. That looks pretty good. Let's zoom out a little bit first so we can see more of the surroundings. Go back to that mask, got our overlay. So let's make the adjustment first so you can see the difference that this makes, and then we'll further narrow down our mask by adding those additional selection methods. So the easiest way to add both warmth and interest to those highlights is just by a simple white balance adjustment. So let's warm that up, go down to our temperature. Make sure you're working under the mask. Don't mistakenly scroll too far where you're under the basic panel, because that is going to affect your global white balance. You want to make sure you're still working inside of that mask here. So up here, warm that temperature up to about 35 or so. You don't have to get extremely precise because we're going to further tailor this with selection methods. So you have more leeway with your adjustments because the mask is going to rein that in. Now, this is a good starting point because it's laying that base that I can refine with additional selections later on. Now, you may be looking at this thinking, this looks awful. This isn't what I thought light painting is going to look like. Do a quick before and after here. Here's the original, and here's that little bit of warming. And it just looks like a yellow filter over the entire image. It's washing out the detail, but I know that I can sculpt this light and make it look fantastic with the masking panel. All we've done so far is just lay the base down. And when you have more experience with the masking panel and know what you are capable of, you're going to have that confidence to move forward. That is a huge issue I see with many photographers. They try out a new technique and the results aren't what they expect, so they tend to recoil and fall back into their old ways because it's familiar and safe, right? So we're not going to do that here. Instead, we are going to add a luminosity selection to this mask that is built around the brighter pixels in this tree line. So let's add that really quickly. Make sure we're still working under that first mask here. I'm going to hold down my option keys so that the intersect icon comes up. Click that, go down to luminance range. Just click anywhere to get it started because we're going to refine this with the luminance range slider up here. Let's check out that luminance map, enable that so we can see exactly what we're doing. Let's widen our range all the way and pull this slider in. Bring this to about 20, the left bookend, and then the right bookend, let's bring that up to about 70. Looks pretty good. And if you're not sure what exactly I'm doing here, those masking videos in the Lightroom cheat sheet walks you through the entire process of setting your luminance range here. All right, so let's turn off the luminance map and take a look. Actually, let's zoom in even closer. We can really see the difference here. So here's that white balance adjustment. And once we add the luminance range, see how sharper that is? It's gotten rid of that hazy warming effect that a white balance adjustment has when you don't rein it in. So that's what I'm talking about with quality, right? You're enhancing the quality by customizing it to the unique content of your image. So the goal here is to use very simple general adjustments like white balance or curves that initially looks rather awful because it's just a blanket color filter, really. It's applied with no discrimination. And then rein that adjustment in with our selection methods because that gives us the most control and flexibility. We can always come in and tweak these selections later. We can remove them, add more to them, adjust the existing ones while maintaining the same adjustments that you did in the panel here. All right, so let's zoom out here. All right, so we've isolated this area by quality. Well, two qualities really, color and luminosity. Open up this mask here. We have our two selection ranges, color range and luminance range. And if we look at the collective mask, we can see that we've done a pretty good job at not only isolating that tree line, but also just isolating these specific highlights. So by intersecting these two selections, we've taken our color selection here and cross-referenced this selection with a luminosity selection here to get the cumulative selection here, the mask. So this mask is the result of pixels that are selected by both of these methods, not just one. It's that Venn diagram I referenced earlier. But looking at this mask, it's still applied to the entire frame, not just the tree line. So let's add another intersecting selection within this mask. And you know what? Let's just add a sky selection. Not add, but subtract, because looking at the mask right now, there are bits of the sky that are in this selection, so we want to remove that. Going to select subtract, go down to sky selection, and now let's look at our mask. Much better, much cleaner. And if we do before and after here, we can see that we've brought back the blues in the sky really nicely. Now, one thing I want to mention about subtracting and inverting selections is that these are the most powerful way to manipulate your mask, because more often than not, it's easier to select what we don't want and then invert it to remove that area from our mask. Because usually when we start our mask, we are selecting too much detail and need to dial that in, like we're doing here. Even with this updated mask, I still have a lot of the ground area that I'm probably going to remove from this mask as well. So by adding selection methods to your mask that removes detail is a great way to sculpt your mask down to better fit your needs. For example, if you needed to select just the ground here, that's going to be quite difficult, especially with your manual selections like the linear gradient or the brush tool. You're going to miss out on a lot of important details. Now, it would be great if we had a ground selection method built into the masking panel, but we really don't need it, because all you need to do, actually let's create a new mask here, select our sky, and we get a nice sky selection from that. Go over to the right panel here and select invert. And now we have everything but the sky selected, which is the same thing as a ground selection. So I just wanted you to keep that in mind as you're building out your mask. It's not just about adding and intersecting. Inverting and subtraction are just as powerful, if not more powerful. All right, so let's delete this mask and go back to our adjustment here. All right, so we got our blues back in the sky. Now that made a huge improvement, but we still have this adjustment on the ground down in here, over the plant and the rocks, which I don't want at the moment. Actually, if we do before and after, this effect doesn't look too bad on the ground. Warmed it up really nicely, but for me, I prefer that nice variation of colors in the water and also along the shadow side of the plant here. Now we could grab the brush tool and literally just paint over where we want this adjustment to be or not to be. So a good way to do this would be to add a intersecting mask, holding on the option key to get the intersecting option. Go down to brush tool, and basically wherever you paint, right now we'll have this adjustment visible. So I just want on the tree line, so let's just paint over the tree line. And take a look at our mask, and that's looking pretty good. Very clean. And if we zoom in here, do a quick before and after, there's some very nice light painting on the tree line, but not on the sky or the ground. Perfect. Now, one thing I want to mention here, if we look at the bottom of our mask, see how I painted over the grass in the foreground? The problem with the brush tool is that the transition zone, where we go from a fully visible adjustment, full on, to where we don't want the adjustment to be in black. So between this point right here, the bottom of the tree line, down into the grass right here, that zone, sometimes that's too small. The transition is too abrupt, which can give us this awful effect where we can literally draw out where the adjustment starts and ends. You can see exactly where it was applied. So right now, do before and after here, it looks fine to warm up this area, but sometimes it doesn't look good. So what you can do is actually add another intersecting selection, go down to linear gradient this time. You can just drag a linear gradient down to further smooth out that transition zone. So if we look at the cumulative mask here, you can see how that area now becomes tapered out, where it slowly fades into black, as opposed to this, where it's a very sharp drop off. So that is a great tool to use for an adjustment like this. You can also use the radial gradient here as well, but I like the linear because we can drag it right up against the bottom of the tree line here and then reposition it as necessary. If you keep your overlay on, you can see the results updated in real time. Now, if you aren't entirely sure what intersecting masks do or how subtraction, addition, or inverted masks all work together to create your transparency map here, the mask, don't worry, because the masking panel, it can seem very overwhelming at first. And many photographers agree with me on that. So what you can do right now is download that Lightroom cheat sheet that I referenced earlier. That has some additional resources in there that will explain how these selections work in complete detail. There's no stone left unturned. All right, so let's turn off this overlay. And the point of this mask is to add some light painting, some reflective highlights to the tree line. And I think we've succeeded in laying that foundation for the adjustment, but we still need to enhance the local contrast of those highlights. So although we've certainly added interest with this adjustment, really doesn't make that tree line stand out more like I want it to. We need more texture. So let's add another mask, and once again, we're going to start with a color range selection. So create new mask, go down to color range. Now we could also start with a lightness selection, but we're going to narrow our pixels down with our point color tool inside of this mask. So we're really just isolating the tree line with the mask itself. The adjustment will narrow down even further. So let's sample a nice green again, or just anything that isolates this tree line. Now, as you can see, color range can be both a quality or location selection method, depending on the image, because sometimes the subject you need to select is most easily isolated by its color. So don't limit yourself into thinking that the range selections here, that they're just about pixel quality. They can be used to isolate the physical area that you want to adjust as well. For example, if you have like a bright red cabin in the middle of the woods in winter and there's snow everywhere, it's probably a lot easier to isolate that by color as opposed to luminosity or object selection. All right, so we got a good selection here. Let's dial in our range a little bit to isolate this even further. Maybe something like that. Go down to point color, open that up, and let's isolate. Nice highlight in the tree line. That's looking pretty good. Let's go down and adjust our ranges. Expand that if we need to. Luminance, I like to select everything, as well as saturation, because you want that effect to be nice and tapered out. All right, we got a nice selection. Now let's make the adjustment. Let's bring up the luminosity, some of the saturation, and let's shift the hue as well. Turn on visualize range, and let's do a quick before and after of this mask. This is a really nice improvement. It's very subtle, but notice how the highlights on that tree line now appear a little bit brighter and more textured, in a very natural and tapered way. But again, it's being applied to the entire image. If you look at the mask itself, it's all over the place. So we're adjusting the quality of those pixels, but now we need to select them by location. So let's add a brush selection method that intersects with our existing mask here, just like we did before. Hold down the option key, go to intersect, down to brush tool, and once more, we're just going to paint over the area we want this adjustment to be on. Let's show our overlay here so we can make sure that we are painting over the entire tree line. Don't worry too much about including the sky, because that's being tapered in by the point color tool. So we turn the overlay off, do before and after the adjustment itself. You can see that no changes are being applied to the sky, just the highlights along the tree line, thanks to our point color tool. Excellent. And actually, once you have this environment set up, we can zoom out a little bit. Once you have this environment set up, you can actually paint over additional areas that you want this highlight boost to be on, this light painting. So maybe down in this bush in the foreground, you know what? We can brighten that up a little bit. Maybe over here, do a quick before and after. That actually looks pretty good to apply to this foreground bush as well. So you can always add or remove areas from this adjustment easily when you've already refined it like we have. Okay, so I'm looking at this adjustment and I'm thinking we can probably push this a little further. A little more texture and interest, really bring out how these highlights are applied to the tree line. So let's go back to our initial mask here, mask 1, and make a tonal adjustment. We haven't done any tonal adjustments yet. We've just been working with color. So your tonal adjustments, they're really going to make those highlights stand out by adding that lightness contrast. So let's bring up the whites. So maybe right about here, around 25. Bring up the exposure as well. Oh, not that much. Maybe like a quarter of a stop. Let's zoom in. Do a quick before and after here with our history panel. Before the tonal adjustments, and here is the after. Wow, that made a huge difference. It really made that area pop. Now, one more adjustment I want to make while I'm here is a curves adjustment. Now, typically I would not use curves for light painting because the effect, it's too tapered. Look over here under the tone curve. So we're working along this curve line. So we do have some control over which lightness values this adjustment will affect. Actually, first make sure you're working on the point curve, this one right here. We can set a point here and a point here and be like, okay, we just want to affect these values right here. It's still pretty tapered and it can be quite intense and muddy up some of the detail that I want to retain here. However, we've already created this highly customized transparency map right here. And that's going to work to rein in that curves adjustment. So let's go to the red channel. Make sure you're working under mask number 1. Go down to curves under the red channel. Bring up my black point into red. Not too far, maybe like around 20. Then add a point right around middle gray. And maybe bring that up just a couple points. So my input is 134, my output is 144. So just 10 points. Before and after of the curves. See, how a very slight adjustment like that has done a lot of work to warm up this tree line and just make it more interesting. But there are some odd colors going on over here on the right hand side. So I'm actually going to go over to my blue channel, grab a midpoint right around here, and I'm going to greatly drop this down into yellow. Get a real deep curve going here. Because we've made such a huge restriction with our mask, we can make an adjustment like this and have very little difference in the image. Do a quick before and after. That is quite a difference. And actually, it's before my curve adjustment, and here's the after. Zoom out to fit. Let's see how this looks in the entire image. Before the curves, after the curves. So this adjustment actually made a huge difference to the mood and the atmosphere of the image. But we're still retaining that green along the trees because we're working inside of this very restrictive mask. This transparency map, which has been created to restrict this adjustment to the brighter pixels along the tree line. Actually, let's compare the results here as if I didn't have the protective mask in place. So this is what the adjustment looks like if we didn't have the restrictive mask with our multiple selection methods. This is what the mask actually looks like. I just painted over the entire tree line, added that curves adjustment, and this looks pretty awful. But when you add all these different selection methods to create that tailored mask, this is what the adjustment actually looks like. So those two quality selections, the color range and the luminance range, gives us a much more specific mask and constrains the curves adjustment to very specific pixels within that defined area, the tree line. So it's a very dramatic adjustment, but with a very tailored specific stencil in place. So creating a mask like this, it allows you to utilize adjustments that were otherwise too powerful to use. It's a stencil that we lay down to work within, and it's one that we can easily amend if we need to. It's like controlling the flow of a faucet. Do you need more or less of this adjustment? All right, so let's take a look at a complete before and after of the entire masking panel. Here's the original image before any adjustment. Tree line's very dark, muted, doesn't stand out at all. But when we add those two masks with our light painting adjustments, this has made a huge difference. This area demands much more attention and it just completely changes the overall flow and balance of the frame. Your eyes are instantly drawn to this tree line now, where before it just wasn't demanding any attention at all. You would completely skip over it. Now, when I was in the field taking this photo, those reflective highlights on the trees, they really stood out to me. So I'm happy that I'm now able to recreate that quality with a light painting mask. And thanks to our layered selections here, we were able to add this light painting at the highest quality possible. And we've created an environment that we can easily jump back into and amend it if necessary. So when I do my light painting here in Lightroom with a golden hour image like this, I use this two-tier approach where we first apply a very general, subtle warming effect to the entire area that we want to add some highlights to. And then I come in and add another mask to isolate select highlights of an area that I want to draw more attention to, and then widen that lightness gap to enhance the texture of those highlights to make them really jump out at you. Because when we increase the contrast, we increase texture. And when we increase texture, we increase that perceived depth and just the overall interest. So when we have two different masks that on paper have very similar adjustments and selections, they're built in a very similar way and they have similar results to warm and to brighten. But the intent is different. One mask warms up the entire area and the other one just brightens up the highlights. So when you isolate your adjustments like that by intent, by using multiple masks on the same image, the quality is much better. And these adjustments are much easier to amend later on if you think that they need some further tweaking. And actually, I'll show you an example of that right now. So let's jump over back to Lightroom here and refine one of these masks a bit further. Actually, now that I'm looking at this, the dramatic before and after, this is a little bit too strong. It's too overpowering. So I can go back into our first mask here, and I'm going to scale back on this curves adjustment. Maybe cut this by half, go over to the red channel here, and I'm going to bring this midtone back down to center. I think that adjustment was a little bit too heavy. Now let's do before and after the curves. That is looking much more natural. And once again, before and after the entire masking panel, huge difference to the overall impact here. Now, before we wrap this video up, I want you to take a look at the color wheel. I added this for a reason. We haven't even looked at it yet. Zoom out a bit. I'm going to go over to our first mask and I'm going to turn off any location-based selection method. So it would be the brush, the gradient, and the sky. So we're just focusing on the color range and the luminance range. Let's take a look at the mask here, particularly over the color wheel. This is highlighting the specific hues of each color that is being targeted by the color and the luminance range working together. So we're seeing the exact colors and tones that we've narrowed down with just these two selection methods. So see how each of these two selection methods, color range and luminance range, target a very specific part of the color wheel. So anything that is selected both by color range and luminance range gives us our final mask here. Extremely powerful, only with two selection methods. So just imagine when you add more to it. And of course, the additional restrictions from the adjustments themselves. For example, the point color restricting this entire adjustment to a specific hue. When you factor all of that in, it's easy to see how we can actually obtain a Photoshop level of accuracy here within the Lightroom interface. So it's really fantastic that you can now do this in Lightroom. And that actually is a nice segue into the point of this entire lesson here. You may have thought it was just about light painting, but what I really wanted to demonstrate here is just how powerful and dynamic the masking panel can be. And we're just scratching the surface here. These light painting masks, they are a very straightforward, basic way to build a mask. You just add a few selection methods together, and you can make some very simple adjustments. But there's so much more to learn here about masking, and if you download that Lightroom cheat sheet that I mentioned earlier, there's a link in there to also download those free video lessons on the masking panel. And these are deep dive videos that discuss everything there is to know about building masks for advanced adjustments. And trust me, these masks will transform your workflow. You are going to absolutely love them because they open up an entire world of possibilities right here in Lightroom that just wasn't possible before. You'd have to go over to Photoshop for this level of accuracy. So if you want to be an expert in masking, I highly recommend downloading that free cheat sheet. All right, I hope you found these tips helpful. Thanks for joining me, and I will see you in the next video.